Thank you, John. I am going to expand a little bit on the yield monitor side, specifically talking about when we're collecting data for on-farm research, what are some of the things that I want us to think about? So some of the other speakers have alluded to this. When you're looking at setting up your on-farm trial or your research, the most important thing that you need to think about is what is your goal? What is the question that you want to ask? What is it that you want to learn from this research? What do you want to get out of it? So let's take, I've got a couple examples up here, and I'm about to point at them with the pointer, and it's not going to work. So maybe you want to look at population with your planter, or maybe you want to look at differences in fungicide. Are these some questions that you guys wonder if they're effective on your farms? Maybe you want to compare hybrids or varieties. How many producers do we have in the room? All right, excellent. I like that. That makes me happy when it's mostly farmers. So how many of you guys are running on-farm trials on your own farms? Oh, great. That's a wonderful, about half. That's a wonderful percentage. So are these the questions you're asking in a lot of cases? All right, cool. Oh, and then I had one that just pops up. There's a nitrogen trial. So maybe you're thinking about that. I don't want to jump to that one yet. So when we're talking about these different trials, what sorts of data are you guys collecting? Yield? Anything else? Population? Anything else? All right. Well, I'm glad that yield came up first and then there was a silence after that, because I think that yield is probably the one variable that we're collecting data on no matter what our research is. So I want to talk for a while about collecting yield data. And when we're talking about on-farm research, I think there are two common ways that you're going to collect yield data. And the first is using a wagon and weighing all of the grain from that plot. How many of you guys are still running your trials that way? One. So everybody else who raised their hand is going to raise their hand when I ask who's using a yield monitor. We got to get exercise after lunch. Burn off those calories, guys. I'm going to ask you to do a lot of moving. So the other option is using your yield monitor, and I think that's becoming more and more common as we see that technology employed on farms. But there are certain considerations we need to take when we're thinking about how we're collecting that data. And even if you're doing it the old-fashioned way with wagons, you still have to pay attention to making sure that you're getting quality data with your wagons, right? So we're going to tell you, if you read the literature, to make sure that your scales are calibrated. Usually the guys at the elevator are more than happy to weigh something for you, run it across the scales, and make sure that you're getting the same reading with your wagon that you're getting with a certified scale. And then it's important to don't record your weights when you're running at 10 miles an hour across the field. Make sure when you're writing down that weight, the wagon is stationary and level so that we're getting high quality information. And then, not on this slide, but take into consideration if you're using more than one wagon, whether those scales match up with their readings. But when we start talking about yield monitors and using that to collect data, the considerations grow, right? There's a lot more things we need to think about. We still need to think about our wagons, right? Because we're going to use those to calibrate. But even more basic than that, we need to make sure that our yield monitor components are all installed correctly, then that we're calibrating it correctly, and then finally, before we even use that data, even if we calibrated, we need to think about and look at how we're processing it and whether that data needs to be cleaned. So those are the things that we're going to talk about for a little while. And the first is calibration. How many times have you guys heard somebody get up here and tell you that you need to calibrate? I think I've heard it at least 10 times just today in this room. That's how important it is. It's perhaps one of the most important things that you have to worry about when you're collecting yield data on the farm. But why is it so important? Does anybody have any clue why they keep telling you to calibrate? Does it really make that big of a difference? Are you guys all nodding yes because we've told you or because you know? I'm glad that everyone is nodding yes. But I think we need to dig into, to really understand why it's important, we need to dig into how that yield monitor works. And so what the yield monitor is going to do is it's going to wait till some grain hits the impact sensor. And it thuds. It hits it with a thud. That's the noise right there. And then a number pops out, like 0.45. And if you think that this number is your yield, you're going to be sorely disappointed, because I really hope my yield is not 0.45. what's going on here is that reading that your impact sensor is giving you is a number as a voltage. So this number is probably going to range from 5 to -5. So if it would have popped up and been -4 or 5, you would have been really upset, right? But luckily, the yield monitor has more work to do after it collects this value. So that number goes to your yield monitor, and your yield monitor thinks, it does some calculations, and it pops out 12 pounds per second. Now we're talking. This is a number that makes sense to us, right? You can pretty much guess what 12 pounds per second of corn would look like. But that's not what we're using for decisions, right? We're talking in bushels per acre, so there's still even more calculations that need to go on. So your yield monitor software takes into account that 12 pounds per second, and then other information like the test weight and the distance that the combine's traveled since the last time that it did this calculation, and it does some fancy math that's going to give you that number in bushels per acre that we really care about. But the question really is, how does the combine, how does the yield monitor know that 0.45, I need to come up with a better number so I don't trip over it. How does it know that 0.45 equals 12 pounds per second? You guys already know the answer, so shout it out. The calibration. So this is why calibration is so important. I've got 2 calibrations up here, and it's going to have to be somebody in the front row because it's a little small. Calibration A is last year we checked the calibration, it worked great, so we don't have to do it again this year. We don't have to do it again this year. It was right, it was dead on last year. So that's calibration A. Calibration B is if we followed the manufacturer's advice and we calibrated again. So that impact sensor reading gives us a reading of 4 on both of those. So somebody in the front row, what does the calibration A tell us 4 turns into in pounds per second? That's right, I'm not quite tall enough. Can anybody in the front row read that? About 14. All right, calibration B, that same 4, 17. 14 and 17, that's only 3 different. That's almost nothing, right? They're the same. Everybody's shaking your head. You guys are way too smart for me. So once the combine, the yield monitor does all of this calculation, 14 becomes 150 bushels per acre. And with your second calibration, that same impact sensor reading of 4, which is 17 pounds per second, comes out to 180 bushels per acre. So now we're starting to really wonder, maybe I should calibrate because I would much rather think that I have 30 more bushels, right? Just calibrating really isn't good enough. You have to make sure that you're calibrating correctly, properly. So this is an example of if you have a multi-point calibration, that's what you should do, but you just go out and take 2 loads. So here on this first example, we got our first calibration point at low flow, and we did a great job. It's right there in the data with all the rest of the low flow points. It's a really accurate calibration load. We did the same thing with our high flow. We got a really good, accurate high flow calibration load. And our calibration just calculates that linear correlation between those 2 points, and that's how it converts. Here is if we would do it with 4 very accurate calibration loads. And what's the first thing that you guys see? Right, in your field, where are most of your yield points going to end up? Probably somewhere in the middle. You hopefully don't have any low flow areas, and we're not all lucky enough to have all high flow areas. So here in this middle area, this first calibration with only 2 points is much less accurate. We're overestimating our yield points at those flow rates. So this is why they tell you to use different flow rates and mimic the flow rate with speed or partial header harvesting to hit all of those different flow rates that your yield monitor might see in the field. So the other thing they tell you is that you need to check your calibration throughout the season, right? And has anybody ever showed you data as to why this is important? I didn't really ever see it before. This is from a field. Just conveniently is a small field, so it's harvested last every year because we get to it when we get to it. It's too small, it doesn't really matter. So what this gave us, well, that combined with the fact that they weigh all of the grain from each of their fields, gives us the opportunity to see how accurate our calibration was by the end of the season if we didn't recalibrate. So what we have here is the scale weight in the first column, and then the weight that the yield monitor measured for that field in total in the second column. And then that third column is our error. So that's how far off we were between the scale weight and what the combine thought we had. So the first thing you can see is that sometimes we have a lot of drift. In 2009, we were off by almost 9% by the end of the season. Some years, we do all right. There was one year that we were in 2013, we were within 1%, and then 2 other years, we were within 2%, and that's pretty good. And then this third one is a bonus, because that was the year that I was a PhD student, and I went down knowing everything, and told them that they needed to recalibrate in this field so that I would have high-quality data. Well, like I said, this is a small field. It's got a lot of variability. It's a junk field. And this is what happens when you don't find a good spot to get a good calibration, because with the topography changes, we didn't get a good, consistent yield pass, so our calibration didn't really turn out to be that good because of the variation in that field. And I learned a lot. So once we've got our calibration down and we know that we did the best job we could collecting that data, we still need to think about data quality because we have to take into account post-processing. So how many of you guys know what's going on inside the combine? All of you? Jenkins raised his hand. I took that class with him, the what's going on inside the combine class. So first we're going to switch out on this one to our corn head. We're going to get out there. We're going to start harvesting corn. So there it goes. It hits the header. And it's going to travel on its journey through the combine. And finally, it hits the spot where the impact sensor is. And that's when we measured our yield. There was a lot of time between when that corn entered the combine and when it left, right? That was probably a little faster than real time. So the way that we account for this when we're looking at our data is with our flow delay setting. So this is a yield map. This is what your yield map would look like if your flow delay setting was 0. And you'd be scratching your head thinking, well, I am pretty darn sure that I planted corn at the end of that field. So in this next map, it's a 10-second flow delay, which is with the yield monitors that I've worked with. That's the default setting. So it automatically puts it back to 10 for you. And this map looks a little bit better. Conventional knowledge tells you to get the best one, you want to find an area of the field where you expect some sort of linear yield change, and then try to line that up and make it look like what you think it should look like in the field. So this is a gully in that field. And again, somebody towards the front, which one of those two do you think looks better? Which one looks more like a straight line? It's tough. It depends on what color you look at, right? So that's one of the challenges I think we're facing with flow delay. When we looked at the data here and in a couple other areas, we ended up choosing 12. And I think if you look at the orange, maybe 10 looks better. If you look at the yellow, which is hard to see on this screen, the 12 is a little bit better. Getting your flow delay right is really important because if you're off, I think that the last guy showed this same yield map. If you're off, you have a hard time looking at that yield map and telling what the variation looks like, right? It kind of looks like a mess. Whereas if you get those yield data points in the right spot, you can start seeing variation in the field a lot more clearly. So I think up until now, a lot of people have always talked about why flow delay is important because we need to get it in the right spot, right? But I'm here to tell you today that it's a little bit more important even than that. So to demonstrate this, I need 5 volunteers. All right, here you go. You can be in seat 1. I need 4 more volunteers. Spots are filling up fast. Okay, now they're not filling up so fast. Are you willing to help me? No? Are you willing to help me? No one's willing to help me. Here you go. I'll start calling on people. I taught undergrads. It's all right. I promise you can't mess it up. The answers are written on the back of the card. I don't even ask you to do anything. All right, I need 1 more. Debbie's going to do it. Excellent. Oh, well, I'll be person 5. That's fine. I've got it. So you've got 2 cards on your chair. See, everyone has 2 cards on their chair. The first card, the orange one, is your crop flow reading from your yield monitor. The pink card is the area reading. So you guys can't see the slide, I'm sorry. But the same flow delay, when the crop enters the header of the combine, that's when your yield monitor records the area. And that's calculated by distance traveled times the swath width of your combine. So that's your pink card. I want you to set your pink card down on the floor in front of your feet. So here we go. Here's this time thing again. The corn's going on its journey through the combine. And there we go. We finally hit the impact sensor. We have a reading. That's your orange. With a little bit of math, that's your orange card. So when we move those data points, what do you think happens? What do you think happens, John? Do you think that both of those data points move with you when you change your flow delay? That's the right answer. The answer is no. So right now, the way they're sitting, it's from a real data file, and this is with a 12-second flow delay. So if you turn your card over, we're going to go down the line. The number 1 is calculated, your bushels per acre calculated with the orange card of the flow where you're at and the pink card of the area. So flip your card over, and right there, number 1, what's your yield?
213.
What's your yield?
205.
193.
184.
195.
All right. So maybe our flow delay is not right. So we're going to delay it by 2 seconds to try to adjust it. So all of you guys need to stand up, and each chair is 2 seconds. So shift over 1 chair. All right. You're off the map, but you still have an area. So there you go. So now, how many of you guys speed up and slow down when you're running your combine to try to keep your flow consistent? I think that you guys are lying to me. How many of you guys speed up and slow down? All right. So the speed for each of these data points varies a little bit, just a little bit. I think this was in a calibration pass, so we were trying really hard to keep a consistent speed. So the speed changes from about 2 miles an hour to 2.2 miles an hour. That should make almost no difference, right? But each one of these areas, if you could see the floor, this yield point would be 3.9 acres per hour. This one is 4, 4.1, 3.8, and 4. That doesn't sound like it would make a difference either. But, okay, I want you to remind everyone what your first yield value was, and then tell us what your new recalculated yield value is at this new flow delay setting.
Well, number 1 was 213, and second one is 208.
Went from 205 to 201.
Went from 193 to 208.
From 184 to 175.
And 195 to 191.
All right. So some of those seemed like a big difference, right? But when we average them, the difference isn't quite as bad. If I averaged at the first flow delay all of those yield points, it's 198 bushels per acre. After the flow shift, our new average is 197 bushels per acre. But we're only talking, this is 5 data points. So if we impound that over an entire field, you can see how making sure that your right yield value is with the right area that it came from can really impact your yield values that you're getting from your combine. Thank you guys so much for helping me out. You guys will never forget that your flow shift is important. So there's still some other things that I want you to consider with your post-processing. That's just the first one. It's incredibly important. But it's also important to check and make sure that your other settings were also correct. So make sure that your dry moisture value is set properly, that your bushel weight is proper, and look at your start and stop delays to make sure that you're including the data that needs to be included. Making sure that your GPS offset is right. Those are all things that you want to look at with your yield data. So then data cleaning is also important. We need to take a look at how the data was collected to make sure that there's not things in there that we don't want to be in there. So combines, they're messy machines. They were invented to collect yield, or collect corn, collect your beans very efficiently. And they're great at that. They were not created to collect data. So they have some challenges doing that. So how many of you guys are Twitter people in here? A couple? Are you familiar with hashtag cabcorn? In my longer presentations, I like to show a video, but we don't have time today, unfortunately. But go to YouTube and Google cabcorn, and what you're going to see is what happens when you've got a guy running a combine, talking on his cell phone, who has to make a sudden stop because he's full and his grain cart hasn't got there. And there's a waterfall of grain. It's very dramatic. It's hilarious as long as it's not your grain that just comes waterfalling over the front of that combine. And from my data quality mindset, when I see that video, I think, oh my gosh, it's going to take forever for that yield monitor to recover from that sudden stop. So these are the sorts of things that I want you to start thinking about when you're looking at your yield data. So some definite points of interest when you're looking and cleaning your yield data. Look for areas where you might have had to stop suddenly. Swath width. How many of you guys are using auto swath detection on your combines now? That can cause some issues if you got some GPS drifts, if you get along a tree line. So look for those sorts of things. They usually stand out. It's going to be a linear line through the field. Or another spot that they manifest themselves are on the end rows. If you're exiting on point rows and your header's only partially full, you might see that. Header height errors. This is from a field that I worked with. This one really stands out because there was no corn over there, I'm pretty sure. But in that specific example, my 14-acre field measured 21 acres because the header height setting was off that year. And let me tell you how much that impacts your yield average. It really hurts. So these are the sorts of things, to you they might be obvious, but if you're sending your data off without looking at it and having someone make decisions, it can be less obvious when you're not looking at a yield map. So the last thing I want to talk about before we close are in-season notes. I think a couple people have touched on in-season notes and how to collect them. I think there's several very important roles that in-season notes play, and the first is going to be your treatment validation. So when you're running an experiment, you want to make sure that you're measuring what you think you're measuring, right? So say we're doing a population study. Additional data that you might want to go collect would be stand counts to make sure that your stand that you got actually matches up with the population that you thought you planted. Disease ratings. Say you're doing a fungicide trial. I think going out and making sure that there is disease pressure is an important piece of information you want to know. Whether there's disease pressure across the whole field. If there's spatial differences in your disease pressure, that can influence your results. And then I think general notes, I'm going to touch on that in a second, can be very valuable over time. The next thing is just quality control. Again, making sure that what you have out there is what you think, and then look for compounding issues. Flooding in a field is a good one. Hopefully the imagery guys talk about some of this later, because I think this is a really exciting use for that kind of data. Looking for differences in spatial variation other than what you're trying to test. So maybe there was a flood, in my specific example I had plots and a guy turned on the irrigator and he was supposed to come out 2.5 hours later and turn it off. And he had a couple drinks and didn't come back out. So the north half of my field looked like we had planted rice. And that was really hard to overcome with my data analysis later on in the year. But being aware of these things can help you to make sure that your data that you're collecting for your research is going to give you good results. And then I think maybe, this is looking towards the future moment, I think maybe the most important and valuable part of some of these in-season notes are going to be how we use them in the future. So big data is promising that we're going to be able to move past these averages, move past the means, and start making decisions for specific instances on your farm in a given year, right? That's what they're promising you. So I guarantee that the data is going to get there, but are you going to be ready for that? Are you going to know on your ground what the right thing is to do? On that specific acre when this thing happens, what works for you? And so this is, I think, that added bonus of collecting that in-season data along with your trials, is that you know what your yield response is, but you have this extra data, so you know exactly what you did and what the conditions were. So when we're able to, when John and I get this figured out, and we bring you this data, you'll know where on your farm that data is useful to you.